Okay, so last class we were talking about the SSL attacks. Since it was a few weeks ago, I'll just go over it in a little more detail. So we had broken the kinds of attacks into three. So there was one where we were actually going to break into the tunnel, the secure tunnel. A lot of kind of crypto-related attacks or implementation-based attacks in that side. Then we had everything that you could learn even if you couldn't break the crypto. So it turns out that HTTPS isn't perfect security. It does leak some information. So for example, you have to say where the packets are going, otherwise they won't end up at the right place. So that can tell you some information. Even though it's encrypted, it's length preserving. That generally shouldn't be a big deal, but the way the modern web is, where you're kind of weaving together a lot of content from a lot of different sources, you can kind of build a fingerprint of what a web page might look like under encryption, and then you can sort of recognize it when you see a user go to it. That works for like public websites. It doesn't work for everything. You can always just store it and hope that you can break it in 50 years when we have quantum computing or whatever the case may be. And that won't actually work. That technique is very crypto specific. So there is ways of doing the cryptography. Well, it depends. I guess it technically depends on what cryptographic primitive breaks. But anyways, the quantum computing is just completely fictitious. In TLS 1.3, even if you had a quantum computer today, you wouldn't be able to break things later. You could break the protocol in the sense that if you were on the wire at that time with the quantum computer, then you could break the connection. But if you store it and try and break it after, you're not going to be able to break it, assuming that everything we know about quantum computing is true. But that's fine. The final category is you're going to try and do something to disrupt where that tunnel ends. So you have a secure tunnel. It goes somewhere. If it doesn't end where you think it ends, if it ends at the adversary instead of the website that you're visiting, then you might as well just not have the tunnel. So it's important to think about where the tunnel ends. In order to do this, we have these certificates. With certificates, we have certificate authorities. There's a lot of them. They don't use really great procedures for issuing certificates, especially if it's a fully automated, domain-validated process. Even with an EV certificate, you might be able to do some social engineering. There's a lot of CAs. There's hundreds of them. If you can compromise one, any CA can issue a certificate for any site. So you could use legal mechanisms or try and breach that actual CA. Okay. Another thing that we were just sort of on the cusp of talking about is there's a bunch of validation procedures. So when we look at certificates, we have a bunch of conditions that we're testing for. So we want to make sure that the domains match. Let me pull up the list. Here we go. Okay, does the certificate actually match the correct domain? So it should be an obvious thing, but sometimes for various reasons, implementations weren't checking for that. Okay, so go-to-fail was a bug that caused that not to happen. Are they actually signed by a trusted CA? So that's another question. And is everyone on the chain actually a CA? So it turned out that you could just get a site certificate, which doesn't designate you as a certificate authority. It's just a certificate. But you could just act like a certificate authority, use that certificate to go around and sign other certificates. And some implementations would accept that. Because technically it does chain back. They just weren't checking that field that said the CA was actually a CA. Okay. Certificates, if they're expired, you're going to get some sort of warning about it. Users might click through that warning. Same with the second case here. If it's signed by a trusted CA and you're wondering if it's going to be chained back through the trusted CA, if it's not, then the user gets a warning. Okay, and so the user might have an opportunity to ignore that warning and just connect to the website anyways. This was a lot easier several years ago. Browsers made it very easy to click through the warnings. Now they've realized that that's an important sort of security usability issue, and so they spent a lot of time trying to make the error messages understandable to reduce click-through rates, and they have been successful. Browsers like Chrome have been very successful at that. Okay. The final thing that we haven't talked about is revocation. So let me just switch the notes over. Okay. So cryptographic keys are something you have. They're something that you might have on your computer, and they could be compromised. If your computer is compromised, your private key could be stolen. If it's a server, usually it's the server setting where these keys are. If there's some sort of breach of that server, someone is able to get access to it, they could lift the key off. Heartbleed might be an attack that we've seen in the past that would allow you to do this, but basically anything that you might do that could breach that server. Okay, so let's say that you work at a company, you have SSL certificates, that's great. All of a sudden, whatever, you're checking your server logs or something like that, and there's strong evidence that you've been breached. Okay, so it seems like an adversary got in, and they probably were able to compromise your key. What do you do? Okay, so that means the adversary could go out and create their own certificate, or they don't even have to create a certificate. Every time you use your certificate, then they could just step in the middle. They know the only thing that protects that connection, which is the key. You might say, well, I'll go out and get a new one. That's fine. So now what's going to happen is you're going to have your new certificate. So let's just pencil in. So idea get a new certificate. So here's Alice. She's trying to connect to your server. She says, I want to talk HTTPS. And then here's your server. And they're going to send the new certificate. And the new certificate, the adversary doesn't know. They don't know the key for it. You choose a brand new key and all of that. Okay? So the adversary can't break it. Okay? But what the adversary can do, if the adversary is in the middle, is when they see the new certificate go back, they just replace it with the old certificate that they've compromised. Okay, so the user never sees the new certificate. They only see the old certificate. If this old certificate is still valid, it's not expired, it is actually signed by a CA, all of that kind of stuff. It's still there. It doesn't violate any rules in terms of its validity. Then the user, of course, will accept it. Once they accept it, then the connection is going to be set up using the cryptography that's inside this certificate, which is compromised. Okay, so what we need is we need some mechanism to revoke. So that's a word. We don't know what that looks like, but we need some mechanism where you can basically a firm whose certificate is compromised can say that certificate's no longer valid. Okay, so how might we revoke a certificate? Any just random ideas? Okay, so maybe some sort of data structure. So blockchain is something I work on. So you could have some underlying certificate, basically ledger that contained all the certificates. If a certificate was revoked, you would remove it from that list. So basically, you would have a list of valid certificates, then you would remove the certificate from it. In that case, you need to actually send the certificate. If we have a list of valid certificates, then we wouldn't even have to send the certificate. We could just, this person could just go and look up that certificate in that list, and they would have it right away. So they could just immediately start talking over HTTPS. So that actually works. That's a perfectly valid approach. It turns out the web wasn't designed that way. So the web was designed where you don't know about any certificates until you see them. So there is no global list of certificates. There is a movement toward making a kind of global list called certificate transparency. It's solving a slightly different problem. It doesn't handle revocation. I'm not going to get into the details on it. It's something you can look at if you're interested in it. But anyways, good idea, not the solution that was decided upon. Is there anything else we could do?
Contact the issuer, tell them that your certificate's been compromised and have them remove it.
Okay, so you can absolutely contact them. You can tell them it's compromised. Now, when you say remove it, though, let's think about what does that mean? What are they going to remove it from?
The validity of the issuer there.
Well, this old certificate signed, like it's a standalone thing, right? It's this piece of data. It's been issued. It's already been signed, and so it's floating out there. You can't go out and grab it, right? And so once it's out there, it's like if you sign a document and hand it out, it's gone, right? You can't revoke that document, right? And so it's a very good suggestion that I want to enforce your right mental model of certificates. And this revocation really touches on it. Once a certificate's issued, it's gone, right? So the CA literally can't do anything about it. Once it's out there, it has their signature on it, somebody has it, and they can't do anything about it. Or at least maybe, is there anything they could do? So they could certainly advertise the fact that it was compromised, right? So they could be like, oh, here's a list of all the certificates that we signed that we now realize are compromised, okay? Now the only question is, how does Alice get that list?
From the browser.
Okay, so there's a few ideas here, okay? So what we could do is we could have a CA actually, let me pencil in the first idea because it was good. So idea one is you could have a public list of certificates. Right, and so this works, but not the way the web would probably be a lot better if this is the approach that was taken, but it wasn't. Works, but not used. I'll put CF mean compared to certificate transparency. So like I say, it's a slightly different problem that it's trying to solve, but it's it is a log of certificates, but when things get revoked, they don't get removed from the log. Okay, idea, so tell the CA it's compromised. The CA, it would be really nice if they could just sort of remove it from circulation. They can't. Once it's out there, it's circulating, so they can't actually do it. But what they could do is they could publish a list of revoked certificates. So this does exist. It's called the Certificate Revocation List. I'll just put the acronym here, CRL. Okay. But now the question is, okay, how is it that Alice gets to it? Yeah.
Oh, that was the question.
Okay. So how does Alice get this, right? How does she get this certificate revocation list? Does she go around to all of those hundreds of CAs and ask for them, right? Does her browser do it? How could we make this work? Okay, and so there's two answers. We're actually kind of in a sort of transition on this issue. So the web worked a certain way for decades, and now because the way it worked for decades is really terrible, there is a shift towards addressing this exact specific issue. Okay, so the way it worked originally is, so the CRL was sort of interesting. People thought it would be a good idea. But the thing is, you can't go around and find CAs. You don't even know who all the CAs are. You might know who your root certificates are, because you do have a list of your root certificates. But for intermediaries, you don't know until you see them. Okay? When you see a certificate, then you know, oh, this is some certificate authority. Okay? And so what they thought is, well, why don't we check when we see it? Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to get a certificate. When we get the certificate, we're going to go over to the CA and say, hey, CA, is this still valid? And they're just going to say yes or no. They're not going to give you the full list of revoked certificates, although you can still get that list. They have a protocol where you just basically send a certificate and they say yes or no. Okay? Okay, so how to get the list. So the idea here was you check when you see a cert. Okay, so this is called OCSP. The acronym just fell from my mind. Online Certificate Status Protocol, I think. And so this is something that a CA is supposed to implement. So it's exactly the same as CRL, except for instead of a list, you're just asking on a certificate by certificate basis. Okay. So what does this actually look like in practice? So here's Alice. She says, I want to talk HTTPS to a web server. And a web server says, great, here's my certificate. And really what they're doing is they're sending sort of a chain of certificates. So maybe this is the root. This is some CA in the middle. And then maybe this is their site certificate, which is signed by some other CA. Okay. So what happens is Alice receives all of these certificates. Okay. Then what she's supposed to do is she's supposed to go over to CA, say the intermediate, and say, first off, she has to find the CA, find a server that's going to talk to her. She's going to send that certificate and basically say, is this valid or not? And the CA is going to respond yes or no. Okay. Then she's going to do it for the other certificate, and she has to do it for literally all the certificates in the chain. And so she's asking, is it valid? Yeah.
Is the question really, is it valid? Because it could be valid and still is compromised, right?
Yeah. So revoked is a better term. Has it been revoked? So it's not asking, she can check all the rest of the validity. So if it's not valid, she doesn't even do this check. She just rejects it right away. Yeah. In this case, yeah, so she's asking very specifically, has the certificate been revoked or not? Okay. So how does she learn where she's supposed to go? Well, it turns out the certificate will tell her. So if we look at a certificate, so let's say we go to Google, and I want to know about this particular certificate. What you'll see is here, there's a website, ocsp.pki.goog, and this has the certificate check. Okay, so basically she'll send information about it to that website, and then it's going to respond yes or no. Okay, you can actually click on it, but it probably doesn't respond to a browser, but you can look and see. Yeah. Okay, so she goes, she says, is it revoked? And then the browser responds yes or no. Yeah.
You said like the industry is in like the transition mode, not fully implemented this protocol.
Yeah.
Is it like some browser supports this and some browser doesn't support it?
Every single browser supports it, but I'm about to show you the problem with it. Yeah, so just hang on to that thought, and then I will answer it in a sec. Okay. Okay, so this sounds great in theory. Okay, it turns out there's a couple problems with this. Okay, first off, who's running this server? So here it's Google because it's a Google certificate, but Google's also the certificate authority. So in general, who is it that's running this server? It's going to be the certificate authority who issues it. Okay. So for example, let's say that Google didn't sign their own certificates. Let's say VeriSign signed Google certificates. You'd be going over to VeriSign and asking. Okay. Now, let's say you guys start a CA. You're like, this looks awesome. I can make a lot of money. I just have to have set up a computer issuing certificates. And so that's great. And then let's say like Google comes to you and we're like, we love your CA. Can you do a certificate for us? And you're like, that's awesome. Yeah, of course I'm going to do your certificate. Okay. So now you're Google CA. Okay. That's really, really good. Now what happens? Well, what happens is every single time one person goes to Google, what happens?
They're gonna come and check.
Someone's going to come to you. Okay. So for every like millions of users per second that Google gets, all of them are pinging your server asking, is this certificate valid? Is this certificate valid? This is certificate valid. And most CAs, they have not just one site. They might do Google and they'll do Twitter and they'll do Facebook or whatever. And so imagine all of those people, every time they're connecting, they're pinging your website and you're just this like CA, right? It's not like you have like a big content distribution network and like a lot of equipment. What's going to happen? You're going to go offline, right? You're going to basically get DOS'd, okay? And so that's basically what happened here. So the first is that this requires high bandwidth. For each CA. Kind of proportional to the popularity of the site that you issued the certificate for. It's a little smaller. It's not like you're serving up content or YouTube videos or stuff like that. You're just saying yes or no. But at the same time, you are getting pinged a lot. Okay? And so what ended up happening is basically the servers were always offline. Okay? So then what browsers would do is they had a decision to make. So they said, okay, you're going to try to ask whether the certificate's been revoked. You're not going to hear a response back. What do? Do we throw an error? That's what we should do, right? Because technically you have no idea whether it's revoked. But the problem is if you enforce this strictly, then your browser would be just throwing errors all the time, okay? And users would hate it. And so what they decided is if you don't hear any response, you simply fail open, meaning you assume that it's okay. So you try to ask if it's been revoked or not. And if you don't hear anything back, then you just assume that it's all good. So historically, CAs couldn't cope with the bandwidth. And so browsers would fail open. Okay, now you're an adversary. You're sitting on this wire, and you have this old certificate that's been revoked. So they try to connect over HTTPS. The website's like, here's my brand new certificate. You drop in the old certificate. Now you know that this person's going to go and check whether it's revoked or not. What do? You just cut the wire, right? You see that request go out. Maybe, first off, you just cross your fingers that the CA doesn't even respond. But if you see that response coming back that says, oh no, this has actually been compromised, you just drop that packet, right? And so as long as you're on the wire between Alice and the server and Alice and the CA, right? If you're a man in the middle on both of those connections, then you can just simply drop the packet. So a man in the middle can drop OCSP response. Okay, and so effectively revocation does nothing, right? It does nothing to protect against an adversary that's in the middle. Okay, another thing you might notice is what protocol does the actual OCSP run over? Okay, so let's say you see a packet coming back and it says this has been revoked. You can also just change it, right? So even if that person, let's say they have their browser, and you can go in your browser settings and make it strict about OCSP. So you can say, I actually want to fail close, so I want to have a warning every time this happens. Well, then an adversary can just flip it and say, right? So yeah, I'll say, or modify if not over HTTPS. Why don't they just run it over HTTPS? Because you need a certificate. Then you're going to have to check if that certificate's revoked. Then you're going to have to do an OCSP response. That's going to be over HSL. You're going to get a certificate, right? And so it's a never-ending circle. Okay? So that's why, yeah. So it has to be over HTTP. Otherwise, it becomes circular. Okay, so it turns out, yeah.
I have one question. Why doesn't browser, for example, let's say they get an answer that the certificate is revoked, and so they can save that answer, and then if another user on another location asks, okay, if that certificate has been revoked, and let's say they don't get a response, they can always take the last response.
Sure.
Based on the time.
It's cache memory, right?
Yeah, sure. So it's true. The browsers could be more proactive to solve this, right? So right now the browser's like, we're not getting involved. We'll put that request out and do our best. But what the browsers could do is they could try to synchronize responses across. Or the other thing they could do is we could go back to this certificate revocation list. And let's say the browser they know about the CA. Like Google surely knows about hundreds of CAs, even if you've never heard of them. Right, and they just have to figure out once. And so if you're using Chrome, they could just go proactively to all these certificate authorities, ask them for all of their revoked certificates, gather them up, and then send them down to the browser. And so it turns out that they do this. So this is what I mentioned before where I said it was in flux. This is the new approach. So because OCSP basically is a failure, browsers are like, we need to do something to fix it. So there's two responses. So the first response is, so these are sort of fixes. So Chrome sort of pioneered this. So they did it first. They called CRL set. I don't know its current status. When it first came out, I saw some measurement studies that suggested that it was actually not very good. Like it was only seeing maybe 1% of certificates or something like that. So I don't know. I assume that they probably have improved since then. But you have to think about what the coverage is. Are they actually seeing 100% of things? Okay. So it turned out that Chrome actually just turned OCSP off. They said this is a waste of time. And then they started doing the CRL set thing. So Chrome will, or basically Google will go out and hand get it, on a periodic basis, and then they'll just send it to all Chrome browsers. So it comes to you. It's not even an update. Now, if you're not connected to the internet to receive it, then you're not going to get that update. But then if you're not connected anyways, then you're probably not looking at certificates trying to assess if they're valid or not. And if the adversary's in the middle, they can also try to disrupt the update of the CRLs. But this is going to be a little harder because what Chrome will do is they'll pin the certificates. They won't actually they won't rely on HTTPS itself. They'll just say, we know our own servers and they always look like this. And so you can always denial service it. I don't know what happens if the browser eventually throws a warning. But anyways, yeah. There was a question? Yeah.
Yeah, well, doesn't that then have a trust issue that you have to trust Google and what you...
Yeah, 100%. So why doesn't Google just issue the certificates? I mean, you're basically trusting them. They're collecting all the information that you need that's pertinent to the certificates. If they're compromised, for example, let's say you breach their CRL set distribution list, then you can basically, you won't get the certificates itself, but if you already have a certificate that you've breached, that's been revoked, then you could turn revocation off. So it is absolutely 100% centralizing trust. Yeah.
You said like it will be like periodic scan and update. So if something happens in between two scans,
Yeah.
that can be a vulnerability.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it turns out that this whole thing is kind of laggy anyways. So even when you're doing OCSP, it should be instant, but the CA has to figure out that the breach is right. They have to know that it's actually you, because I could go to them and say, hey, I'm you, my certificate was breached, can you revoke it because I'm trying to denial service you. So they have to figure out, is this person actually the real person or not, right? And by the way, that's another point. Let me maybe mention this as well. Let me squeeze it up here. I'm just trying to find the best one. Actually, I can put it down here. I'll put it here as another issue. Okay, let's say you're Google and you notice that there's this DigiNotar company. You've never heard of them. They're not your CA, but you go out and maybe Chrome users are seeing, oh, there's these Google certificates that are signed by DigiNotar. And Chrome, because you make Chrome and you're also Google, you tell Chrome that if you ever see a certificate that's not signed by our CAs, phone it home to our security team because there's been a breach. So that's probably why DigiNotar actually got caught. It was when Chrome kind of turned this feature on that coincidentally that's when Komodo and DigiNotar people noticed that these CAs have been breached. Okay, so now you're Google and you know that there's a fake certificate out there, right? Who's going to revoke that certificate? Let's assume that this revocation process works. Who do you have to deal with to get that revoked? You have to deal with DigiNotar. So basically, you don't go to your CA because it was some other CA, and every CA can sign a certificate for every site. And so whatever the sketchy CA was that got hacked, that's the sketchy CA that you have to get to try and revoke it, right? And you have no idea. They could be anywhere in the world. You don't know what language they speak. You're not always Google, right? You're not always this huge company. You might be like a small, like say you were Concordia, right? Then you have to get their attention. You have to correspond with them. You have to prove that you're actually Concordia because somebody somehow proved to them that they were Concordia when they weren't, right? And so you're going to have to like validate yourself to some CA that you never wanted to deal with anyways, right? And so that's the other problem with revocation is that you're actually always dealing with the kind of the weak CA as well. So there's different ways that you might want to revoke. So it could be that it was your fault, you compromised your key or your key server got breached. But it could also be that the CA itself was breached. Now, when DigiNotar and Komodo happened, because the companies that were targeted were big, high-profile companies like Google and like Facebook, everyone knew about it, and so the browsers hand-banned those certificates. So they went in, they did a software update, and they said, we know about these certificates, they're not real. And so they didn't use the revocation process. They actually went in and just blacklisted those certificates inside the browser. And so that was their response. But if you're Concordia, you can't do that, right? You're not going to get Google to change Chrome because you have a compromised certificate. You're going to have to rely on this revocation mechanism, and then you're going to have to deal with some other CA. Okay, so one fix is that the browser can go fix the CRLs for you. The second fix you could do is you could say, well, why don't we make this sort of mandatory? Like, we know these things are struggling with bandwidth, but why don't we just say, if you're a CA, it's your responsibility. If you're going to issue a certificate for a site, it's really your responsibility to make sure that you have a server up that's always going to be live, that's going to be able to respond to these things. And so it kind of turns out that you can't just do that. Like you can't decide, well, tomorrow we're going to start enforcing this, right? Because CAs won't have enough time to change and things like that. So what they did is they decided to roll it out in kind of incrementally. And so around the time that they were developing this idea of an EV certificate, so EV are those certificates that are green, they have an in-person validation process. They also said, wouldn't it be great for EV if we started to have stricter security measures? And so one of the requirements is if you want to issue an EV certificate, you have to support OCSP. You can't just say, sorry, I'm too busy, I'm not going to respond to you. Okay, so all EV certificates are, first off, they're validated in terms of who you actually are. They're not just domain validated. And then they also require the CA. They have stricter requirements on the CA. They're also supposed to register it in a log, a public log. This is the Certificate Transparency Project of all certificates as well. So the second thing is to require OCSP responses for EV certificates. So these are the green certificates. Green for money because they cost a lot. Okay. Yeah.
You say green for money?
Yeah, because they cost a lot.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I was wondering because this is an extra service they're providing.
Yep.
I think they should ask for more.
Yeah, absolutely. So a DV certificate you can get almost for free. There are companies like Let's Encrypt and stuff that will give it to you for free. And because of them, other CAs started offering them for free. If you pay, it's not a lot. It might be like, I don't know, $5 a year or $10 or something like that. EV certificates, I haven't looked lately, but in my mind, they're always about $1,000 a year or something like that. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
they still communicate over HTTP, right, for the response?
Yeah, so the first one, the browser, when the browser fetches it, then they can use HTTPS because the browser knows where it's getting it from. And so it could use a secure connection. For the EV certificates, it's a good question. I believe that it's the case that that they still go over HTTPA. Because otherwise they have that sort of circular. The circular problem could be resolved if the OCSP and the certificate you're trying to validate were both kind of from the same server. But the problem is then if that certificate was compromised, not the site certificate, then you wouldn't know it because you'd be forming a connection with a bad certificate. So anyways, it's sort of complicated. We won't go into those details, but it's not completely impossible to ask over HTTPS, but it's not always giving you the security that you require. Yeah.
So does that mean they are not providing a security in HTTP, but they are providing certificates as well?
So say that again.
I mean, they are not providing security in HTTPS, but they are providing certificate, some sort of.
So the CA that's doing these responses, is that what you mean, or yeah, yeah, yeah. So effectively. Now another thing you can do. So this was a protocol. Someone had it. It's a really nice idea, but it just didn't really work. Is what you could do instead of this whole thing is instead of the user doing this for Google, what if Google did it? So Google would be like, here's my certificate chain. Oh, by the way, 30 seconds ago, I asked the CA to prove that this wasn't revoked. They signed a message saying that this certificate's not revoked. I'm going to staple that in with my certificate. So you'll get down a bunch of certificates, and then you'll get some thing that says basically from the CA, right? The Google is giving it to you, but they went over to the CA and got it. Then Google just has to do it once for all of their millions of users per second. They don't have to do, so instead of you getting a million requests, you just sort of get one from Google. And because revocation is so slow, you have to deal with the revocation server. They have to update their list. Then their list has to kind of get distributed. And so revocation usually takes on the order of days anyways, even though everything's supposed to be kind of live. So even if once a day Google were able to get an OCSP response that was signed, they could just staple it in with their certificates. So it was a really nice idea. The problem is that you basically didn't have a field in the SSL protocol where you could put that information, where all servers would just be happy to pass it on. And so when you would staple these things in, some servers on the backbone of the internet in the middle, they'd be like, that looks weird, I'm going to drop that packet, I don't know what that is. And so that's effectively why that approach didn't work. But anyways, that's a different approach that you can do that's also very sensible and works. Yeah?
What about the browser taking part into that process and having that list every time updated and checking right away, like the time typing in it, and then it checks if this is revoked, and there's no log for it.
Yeah, so you're still pinging it every single time. So it's true that you could try to preload that first, but you do have to ask the server to get its certificate because you don't know who signed it until you see it, right? And so effectively, it's going to end up being the same thing. Like you do have to send that packet to get the certificate. Yeah. And so you could start preforming the connections before the user actually starts clicking. Or if there's a list page with a bunch of links, you could try to SSL connect to all of them first. But anyways, yeah, it doesn't save much time.
I think I heard like that OCSP is disabled on Chrome because it anyway is not useful.
Yeah.
So is it like even now or it was?
So it's disabled for DV certificates. Yeah, and then for EV, my understanding is it's probably turned back on because they do support it. Yeah. Okay, other questions about revocation? Okay. So we've talked about lots and lots of attacks on SSL. I won't make you sit and watch me fill out the tree, but what I will do is I will add these nodes, or I'll give you the tree from last year. I'll put it up as a PDF on the website. But just to pencil them in, there's a bunch of attacks where you just use an invalid certificate. So invalid would be like not a CA in the chain, expired. There was all those like parsing errors and things like that we talked about. So they're in there as well. If you can get a revoke certificate, or if you can get a certificate, a breach certificate, and then the site revokes it, trying to stop you from using it, the revocation probably is not going to stop you. You can probably still subvert that revocation process further. So if you're able to get a certificate that's otherwise valid, it's just been revoked, you can probably sidestep the revocation. Okay, so you can use a valid certificate. In some cases, you can use an invalid certificate. You might be able to use a revoked certificate. There's one final category that we'll talk about, and that is sometimes you can just use no certificate. So many websites have gotten a lot better about this, but this is an attack that definitely worked. Just like I used to do it on the New York Times website because it would, but they've improved. I think maybe 2 years ago it stopped working, and I haven't looked around hard enough to find another site that it works on. But anyways, this is what it used to look like. So you would go over to, like, say this is some sort of news site, and you would be like, load the front page. So you would get like the front page kind of thing. And when you got the front page, it would come over HTTP because it's just the news, who cares? It's not super secure. Okay, so you'd be sitting there looking at your HTTP page, and it would look something like this. You would have all the news items, blah, blah, blah. And then at the very top, it would be like, okay, maybe you want to log in. Why do you want to log in? Well, maybe you have an account. Maybe there's some paid content or whatever the case may be. Lots of websites had logins, okay? So it'd be like, okay, you want to log in. It'd be like, no problem. You know, just put your username here and put your password here. And then there'd be like a little button to submit it, It'd be like a little button that says log in. Okay. And what would happen is the website, they weren't completely dumb. So they knew that you shouldn't send passwords over HTTP, because if you send them over HTTP, anyone that's in the middle can read that password off the wire. Okay. So what they would do is the submit button would actually redirect to HTTPS. Okay. So when you submit information, you're doing, instead of a get, you're doing something called post. So you post, say, your password. But this would happen over HTTPS. Okay? Why would it happen over HTTPS? Well, because the website, the HTML for the website that's displaying this to you, somewhere inside of it, it would say post, and then it would have the address of the server that's going to receive this information, and there they would put HTTPS. Okay? So what would happen is you would click the button, and then you would be redirected to, say, the front page, but now you're logged in. Okay? So you would be redirected kind of like this, and it would look exactly the same, except for up here it would be like, hello, Jeremy, or whatever the case may be. And then you'd realize that this page either is already on HTTPS, or maybe you were redirected to HTTPS and then back to HTTP. But anyway, somewhere in the middle there, there was an HTTP connection. We'll just say that from now on, you're sort of on HTTP. So you started on HTTP. Sorry, you're now on HTTPS. Okay, and lots of websites were built this way. So the landing page, this was called the landing page, would be over HTTP. And then once you logged in, even like Gmail or something like that, like some sort of webmail, you would just go, it'd be like, what's your username, password? When you hit the submit button, then it would transfer you to HTTPS. Or you would put your credit card numbers in, and the page that you downloaded would be over HTTP, but when you hit the submit button, then it would send that information over HTTPS. Okay? What's the problem with this?
How can I understand it? I'll be able to understand it. This is going to be HTTPS.
Okay.
I'm going to put my confidential information right away.
Okay, so let's say I put my password in and I click. Then I'm going to see whether it went to HTTPS or not. Let's say it doesn't.
Yeah.
Then it's too late, right? My password's gone, right? And so once you click that button, you know, you're crossing your fingers that it's going to actually send it over HTTPS. But until you click it, you don't know. And then if it turns out it didn't go over HTTPS, it's over because you just submitted all your confidential information over HTTP. Okay. And so the problem with these submit buttons is that, yeah, you have no indication. And the website could do something like they could put a lock there, but that doesn't mean anything. That's just a picture, right? You could put a picture, and even if it says HTTP, or the website might say, you know, don't worry, we'll redirect you to HTTPS. Okay. So then what an adversary could do is they would sit in the middle, and basically every time this HTTP site would come down, so this HTML site over HTTP, it would come down and it would have a bunch of links to SSL resources. Okay? What the adversary would do is they would take that HTML, and you could build a really dumb like kind of computer in the middle that really doesn't understand what's going on at all. All they do is every time they see an HTML page, what they do is they change all the HTTPS's into HTTP. So they give you a new HTML website. So the page is exactly the same, except for every HTTPS reference is now HTTP, and then they drop that in to the wire instead. Okay. So they grab the HTML, they strip out all the references to SSL, and then they drop it back in, and then it goes to the user. Now the user has this website, and even if yesterday they logged on into the New York Times, and when they hit the submit button, it went to SSL, right? Maybe you do that every single day. This is your routine. Every day you wake up, you log into the New York Times, and for every single day the last 10 years, it's redirected to SSL. That does not mean it's going to redirect to SSL tomorrow. Right? Just because it did it in the past doesn't mean anything. Today there's an adversary on your line, and all they did is they stripped out all the SSLs. So this attack's called Ssl Strip, and there's a tool that does it automatically for you. But anyways, it will, then when you click on it this time, then you're like, oh, that's weird. It didn't go to SSL today. By the way, it's too late because your password just went in clear text over the wire. Okay. So there's no way. Now, there is a way technically, if you went into the HTML of this website, you could find that button and you could look and see whether it's over HTTPS or HTTP. But it's just like you would probably never do that. You'd have to be an expert user. And then people had ideas about whether the browser could tell you about it or not. But the problem is the browser doesn't, like every website does it completely different. So it's never going to find that submit button. And there's lots of buttons on the website or links that do all sorts of things, right? And so it could tell you every single link, whether it's secure or not, or maybe if you hover your mouse over it or something like that. So anyway, people explored that idea, but it never really took off. Now what people do is they realize this is a problem, and so they usually give you the landing page over HTTPS in the first place. So once you're on HTTPS, then you're fine. But if you're going to start on HTTP and then transition to HTTPS, then you could get stripped in the middle. One other attack, sort of another esoteric one. Let's say that I can lure you onto my website. I'm a bad person, and so this is the adversary's website. I can lure you onto my website. Then what I might do is I might be like, I want you to sign into Facebook for some reason. Okay, so you go and you click on this sign into Facebook button, and then a window pops up. And this doesn't really happen anymore because we use tabs and things like that. But anyways, it used to be the case that we'd have a lot of pop-ups. So you have this like little window that would pop up for Facebook. Okay, and it would say, okay, what's your username and what's your password? Is it secure to actually put your password into this? Why not?
Because I'm not going to the website directly, I'm going through another website.
Okay, so if this website refers you to Facebook, but you have an SSL connection all the way to Facebook, right? That's what this is telling me.
Could be a self-signed certificate.
Well, the lock is appearing. Who decides whether the lock appears or not? The browser. So the browser doesn't think it's self-signed.
It's a picture. It's like
Okay. So that's where this attack is going. Let's assume this is actually a pop-up for now. If it's a legitimate pop-up and it has an SSL connection to Facebook, it's actually completely safe to enter your password. Even if you know that this website is compromised, there's no security risk. That's the problem SSL is trying to solve for you. It's like you don't care where you got this referral from. When you have a good secure tunnel to Facebook, it's a secure tunnel to Facebook. Okay? And so there is no security risk if this is actually a pop-up and your browser says that, yes, there is a valid certificate and all the validation happens and none of the other attacks in the attack tree are happening. It's perfectly okay to put your information into this. Okay? Even if it's in like an iframe, although that gets complicated because you won't know where it came from. But anyways, yeah, so SSL makes it possible that you can actually trust this information. Okay. Now, as people have inferred from the name of this attack, what could happen, and so this was just sort of an interesting kind of theoretical attack, is how do you know this is actually a browser window? Right? Notice that this pop-up is completely contained inside this website. What if this is actually like an image on this website? right? Then this lock that's appearing here is just an image on the website, right? So this could actually be part of the page content of the website. So is this a pop-up or content of the page? And so if it's content of the page, then you can display whatever you want because the adversary is completely controlling what appears here. They could even use JavaScript to make it look like a window, and you could even drag it. Like if you click and drag it, it would kind of drag around. Obviously, if you dragged it off of the window, it couldn't do anything about it. Okay? So we have this idea of, in browsers, actually the name Chrome, where it comes from, is all the kind of crap that the browser does, like not the content of the page. So you have the content of the page, and then there's all this stuff around it. The stuff that the browser populates, that's called Chrome. So that's the Chrome of the browser. So Chrome is, so in Safari, all of this stuff that you're seeing up here, this is the browser's Chrome. Here, because it's full page, everything here is the website itself. The scroll bars are part of the browser's Chrome. Otherwise, everything else is the content of the page. Okay. So in this case, anyway, it was kind of an interesting attack where they tried to sort of abuse the fact that you can't always tell the difference between, and they could make this look exactly like a browser window, right? Like it same colors and like with the 3 close bars and all of that kind of stuff. And with JavaScript, even if you click the close bar, it could even close or whatever the case may be. So anyway, so they did a usability study and lots of people fell for it, and they were happy to put their username and password into something like this. But anyways, so this is just another esoteric kind of attack that plays on the idea that you're not going to use a certificate at all. You're just going to completely sidestep trying to get a certificate. You're going to try and trick users a different way. And this plays on the usability. So usability is an issue that we'll circle back to. If you don't have good usability, then you might not, your security might be good, but if the usability is not good and people aren't securely following the processes that you want them to, then you might as well just not have good security. Okay, so this is sort of all I want to say about the tree. So what I'll do is I'll populate the tree fully and post it so that you get. So I'll put to do. So you'll get a copy of the complete tree with all the attacks that we talked about. Now, we just spent like, I don't know, 3 lectures, maybe 4, because there were sort of half lectures on the bookends, talking about all of this stuff. So what, right? What are the kind of key takeaways? Why did we spend so long going through an example? Okay, so first and foremost, when you do, like say a firm hires you and you're going to do some security analysis, you really have to do a thorough job. Okay, so you want to look at all the different angles that you can possibly look at. And when you analyze real life security protocols, it turns out that there's probably lots of different attack vectors, right? Maybe not all the attacks work, but there's a lot of different things that you can explore. Okay, so I wanted to give you sort of a sense of a scale for what these attack trees should be. So they should be very sort of detailed. The second thing is you'll notice that when we look at the tree, there's actually a broad kind of breadth of attacks. So maybe at the very start when I said, okay, we're going to attack HTTPS, you were thinking, okay, we're going to do some crypto attacks. And it's true, there are some crypto attacks here, but you probably weren't thinking, if I have a corrupt government, that's somehow going to factor in. Or if I have a user that's just going to click through warnings, that's maybe not going to factor in, right? And what if I can guess someone's email password, you know? And so at the end of the day, it's like you have social engineering, you have usability, you have legal things, you have regulations, you have the hardcore like coding, mathematical crypto attacks, and all of it gets kind of blended in. And so most real life systems are like this. There's lots of different ways to attack them. And now what we're seeing is a trend away from attacking systems at a technical level and trying to attack them more at almost like a social level. So we'll talk about social engineering in a second. But the reason I picked HTTPS as an example, the reason I really like it, is because there's this wide breadth of attacks. So you have social attacks, you have crypto attacks, you have like legal attacks, you have software bugs, guessing passwords. Okay, so it's not all about crypto, it's not all about network security. Those are important, but when you want to think about the security of something, you really want to think about everything as widely as you can. The attack tree itself is a nice data structure. First off, because you can pull all these different attacks into one kind of presentation. So that's nice. You don't have to use an attack tree. You could just write paragraphs and paragraphs of text about all of these attacks, and that's fine. But the attack tree is just sort of a way to organize the information. Okay, so there's nothing really magical about the attack tree. You certainly wouldn't have thought about killing OCSP responses because you use an attack tree, right? So the attack tree's there to help you organize it. It's not going to invent these attacks for you. You still have to do the hard work of figuring out what the attacks are yourself. Okay, so it helps organize the information. And if you can organize it well, then you might think about new attacks. Like here, I really like. It's like, okay, we could use a valid certificate. We have some attacks where we could use an invalid certificate. We have attacks where we could use a revoked certificate, right? And so it turns out that once you have these three, then you're like, okay, maybe there's some other certificate we could use. Like we have revoked, we have invalid. Oh, what about expired? Or like, you know what I mean? And so when you start to organize it, you can sometimes see trends or patterns. And then you might say, well, there might be more attacks that are under this node over or under a different node. The other one we had was use no certificate. Right, so the attack tree can help you sort of see inferences. The other thing about an attack tree, when it's done properly, is it should sort of, I always describe it as tell a story. And so when you start from a root node and you go all the way to a leaf node, like let's say we go here, along the path it should kind of tell you a story. And the story is usually one of attack and defenses. It's sort of like, okay, you want to do this attack, but there's this thing that's stopping you. So this is how you're going to defeat the thing that's stopping you, but now there's this other thing stopping you, and this is how you're going to defeat it. And eventually you break through all the layers of defense, right? So for example, let's say I'm like, okay, I want to read HTTPS, but I can't because there's this like server authentication. I'm not Google, right? If I was Google, I could read it, but I'm not Google. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get a certificate for Google, okay? But like I can't just go and get a certificate for Google, so how am I going to do it? Well, these have to be issued by someone somewhere. So what if I go and pretend to be Google when they're issued? Then maybe I can be Google and I can actually break HTTPS and achieve my goal. So what about the issue? Well, there's these DV certificates and they send an email. And so all I have to do is I got to figure out the password for Google's domain registrar, right? If I can do that, then I can get this email. And if I can get this email, I can get a DV certificate. Now that I have a DV certificate, I have a valid certificate. I've successfully subverted server authentication. Now the user thinks I'm Google even though I'm not Google, so I can intercept their HTTPS traffic. Okay, so there's a sort of story that gets told, and it should be the case for all of the traces sort of from root node to leaf node. It tells the story of an attack, kind of start to finish, okay? And then anywhere along the line you might deviate. You might say, well, when I get this email, this is one attack, but there's also these 3 other kinds of attacks or whatever. And so by putting them in a tree, you can think about, this sort of goes back to the other point, is you can think about related attacks or different ways of tackling it. It also makes the problem smaller. You start with this really broad problem, and then you're like, well, there's 3 smaller ways that we could solve it. And then you start thinking about how you attack those smaller ones. And so you keep drilling down and making the problem smaller and smaller and easier to attack. Okay, so those are the main key takeaways. Any questions or comments about attack trees before we finally are done with them?
What kind of questions would I expect in the exams?
So in terms of exam questions, I'll ask some questions about HTTPS because now you know a bit about HTTPS. I guess another lesson of this is the attack trees only help to a certain extent. You still have to know about HTTPS. Like if you didn't know anything about HTTPS, you couldn't do a proper security analysis. And so that goes back to the very first lectures where I was trying to make the point that you need some technical background knowledge first. So what I'll ask on an exam is some questions about HTTPS because we spent so long talking about the protocol. In terms of attack trees, I don't know, like I probably wouldn't make you draw an attack tree. If I did, it would be very, very simple. Maybe it might be fill in the blanks on an attack tree or something like that. Yeah. Okay, so the next topic we're going to look at is social engineering. So social engineering is basically where you're going to try and persuade a human to do something that they shouldn't do. Or you can think of it as security is basically to stop you from doing something. So if security is trying to prevent something, if there's a human that's actually preventing you or in the chain of things that are preventing you, and you're able to overcome that obstacle, then we would consider that social engineering. Okay, so it's basically thinking about security at a kind of human level. So I'll phrase it as social engineering involves gaining access where a human is screening access. So they're trying to decide whether you get access or not. And sometimes this is explicit, like the human, it's their job basically to decide, and everyone knows it, the person knows it, and all of that kind of thing. And other times it's more implicit. So they're not necessarily aware that they're providing this service, but they actually are. Social engineering attacks are very prevalent. And we'll tell lots of stories probably next class. And so this is a main tool that's now being used a lot in terms of attacks. It might not tell the whole story. So sometimes social engineering gets you so far and then it kind of switches into a technical attack after that. But real server breaches and company breaches and website breaches and that type of thing, a lot of the stories that we hear about now have some social engineering component to them. Okay, so it's one piece of an attack tree, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of how you might attack something. Okay, I'll give you some quick examples, then I'll tell you the theory behind it, then I'll give you lots of more like kind of detailed examples of it. But just quickly, just so that we know that sort of what we're thinking about, we actually already saw social engineering a few times. So for example, when we talked about EV certificates, these are certificates that are validated in person. One time somebody who used to work at Microsoft showed up, they still had their credentials for Microsoft. They were able to convince the CA to issue a certificate. It was a code signing in this case. But anyways, they were basically lying about who they were. And because the other person believed them, then they were able to get what they wanted. Okay. A common example that's given, let's say you want to breach a server that's internal to a company. Let's say that this is a really big company, so their servers are very valuable, but because they're big, they also, they don't have their own IT staff. Actually, maybe this would happen more in a small company or a medium-sized company. And so maybe there's a third-party vendor that comes in and does all their IT support. Okay, so they have a server room, it's locked. Every now and then somebody comes from the IT company and they go to somewhere. So there's going to be an office administrator somewhere in that firm, and this person is going to walk up to the office administrator and say, I need access to that room. Okay, and then that person's implicitly screening whether or not they grant access. Okay, and so for social engineering, the attack might be that you don't actually work for that IT firm. You want to breach the server. So what are you going to do? You're going to dress up exactly like an IT person, right? You'll have the belt with the wire cutters and like all of that kind of stuff, your like bag of tools. You'll figure out what actual company they use. You'll make sure you have a proper uniform or something that looks very close. Maybe has the logo of the company on the uniform. When you talk, you're going to talk like an IT person, whatever that means. Not be very clear, use lots of jargon, that kind of thing. It helps if you seem to know something about the firm. You know where you're going. You know where the server room is. Maybe you make some small talk first with the office administrator. You're like, oh, hey, did so-and-so come back from their vacation? Not because you have conversations with them when you come and do their IT work. It's because you saw on Twitter that they had pictures of them in the Caribbean or wherever. And so that's the sort of components of a social engineering attack. So you might impersonate. And we'll distill this down a little further. And even if the IT staff is internal, I mean, you don't always know the IT staff when they show up. Another thing, in slang terms, people call them road apples. What you could do is, let's say you want to do more of a digital attack, and you have some malware, you want to get the malware on a server. So there's a firm, they have some computers. Maybe if you can just get it on a computer that's on the network, then that's good enough. Maybe it's powerful malware, could sort of try to move laterally through the network. And all you need is, you need someone to take your malware and load it on their machine. Okay, So that's going to be a little tricky if you walk up to a random person and ask them to load malware. They're not going to do it. So what are some ways around it? So one way you might do it is you could just leave a bunch of USB keys in the parking lot. Oops. Or thumb drives, keys as in thumb drives, in the parking lot. Okay, so what's going to happen? Some employee's going to be on their way. They'll see it lying on the ground. They'll think, oh, maybe that's important. Maybe I can figure out who this is. If I just plug in my computer, maybe there's a file on there and some letters or something like that. I can figure out who it is, and then I can give it back to the right person. Okay, as soon as they plug it in, then it's kind of, and USB is very powerful, by the way. It does, especially on Windows, although they've locked it down a lot since, and I haven't used Windows in years, but it used to be like exceptionally powerful, and now I think hopefully it's not as powerful as it used to be. But another thing you could do is try and get the malware through email. So you see all sorts of like kind of phishing emails and that kind of thing. There's a branch of it called spear phishing. So if you get some sort of generic sounding email that's like full of typos and says something ridiculous and like the email address has nothing to do with anything, and they're like, your email quota is full, like, don't worry, we're going to delete your account in like 30 days, but just log into this link and then you'll be fine or whatever. Like, you're not going to fall for that. But now what people do is they'll do what's called spear phishing, where they spend a lot of time crafting the perfect kind of email. Okay, so what's a perfect looking email? A perfect looking email would be, first off, you can spoof email addresses to a certain extent. There are some technologies like DKIM that make that a little hard. But you would actually spoof addresses of people that are actually in the company. Okay, so you would go on LinkedIn, you would spend some time trying to figure out that, hey, there's this HR department and here's the manager and here's the two people that are under it. I'm going to send the email. It's going to come from the manager. It's going to CC in the other person that works in LinkedIn, and it's going to be sent to this particular victim. Okay, so you're going to spoof addresses of, you know, real employees that would really be talking to each other. And then your attachment's going to be like a PDF or something like that. PDF also notoriously has a bad track record of being way more powerful than it should be. So for example, you can put active content into PDFs. Adobe has also responded to it, and so it's a lot better than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. But in organizations, often they use old software too, because if you have to update everybody, that's kind of a nightmare, and things break, and then people are really upset about it. And so a lot of companies are sort of behind on updating their system, so they might have an old version of Adobe Reader that's vulnerable, and so you make a PDF, and it sounds very innocuous. It's like, here's those budget numbers that we were talking about, or whatever the case may be. Okay, here's the CV of the person that just applied, or whatever it is, and it has a real, like, it looks like an HR document or something like that. So it actually, from the file name anyways, it looks like a real document. And everyone thinks that, oh, I'll never get phished, because we see so many examples of really bad phishing and we never fall for them, that we get kind of lulled into this idea of that's what phishing attacks look like. But in real life, when there's like real stakes for real firms, that's not what phishing attacks look like. They look like things that people spent, you know, a week crafting in order to make it like really sound perfect. And once you click it once, then it's over, right? Then it's done. And even better if that PDF was actually a real PDF, and then you opened it up, and then you would just move on with your life, and you would never maybe even find out that it was a phishing email in the first place. another component that's used a lot is, so we talk about, social engineering is trying to do things with a human, right? And so let's say I'm trying to, I don't know, break into your email account, right? I can use a computer to do that. So I can try and compromise HTTPS, steal your password, steal your cookie. I can try and do your password reset. So I'm going to like try and guess your passwords or that kind of thing. So there's all sorts of technical things that I can do. When social engineering comes in is, for a lot of companies, you can actually just pick up the phone and you can call them and say, hey, like I forgot my password. Can you reset it for me? And a lot of call service employees, they actually have the power to do things like reset passwords. And so now it's a very different game. Now you're trying to convince someone over the phone that you actually know, that you know enough about the person that you're impersonating that you are that person, right? And you can tell them any sort of story you want about why it's absolutely an emergency, that you need access right away, whatever the case may be, okay? So you can try and persuade them using some sort of human pressure, as opposed to, just typing away at a keyboard. Okay, machines can be very strict about, you don't know the right information, you do not get access, right? A machine doesn't care, they don't have emotions. But when someone's standing face to face and you have to tell them, I think you might be lying, essentially is what you're saying to them, that's a lot harder, right? You don't want to be the person saying, I actually don't believe that you're actually a student in this course, or whatever the case may be. And so that can be a lot more difficult. Okay, so this is sort of in the realm of things that we're talking about. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take social engineering, and there's a really nice textbook, I don't know if I would call it a textbook per se, it's a book. It's called The Art of Human Hacking, and so that's on the website, so you can read that if you're really interested in it. It's written by one of the first people to actually do this for their real life job. So they said, we're going to do social engineering penetration testing, but we're going to use a social engineering aspect. And so you'll hire us as a consultant, we'll come into your firm and we'll try all sorts of attacks, and then we'll write a report about what worked and what didn't work. And so he was one of the first to do it. And so his book is really, really interesting. And he had this nice kind of framework where he kind of distilled a bunch of the attacks into different categories. I didn't really like the framework. I thought it was a little more complicated than it needed to be. And there was some stuff that I considered junk science that was kind of mixed in there. So anyways, what I did is I distilled out what I think are a sort of simpler essence. So it's almost the same as his framework. And if I hadn't read his book, I wouldn't have come up with this framework. But it is also slightly different than what he proposes. And so the way I see it simplified is there's really kind of 3 stages to a social engineering attack. Most of them involve all 3. It's possible that you don't involve all 3, but they go as follows. And we'll go into a lot of detail about each of these. We'll talk about psychology. We'll talk about all sorts of stuff that you would never normally talk about in a security course. But what I want to do is, first off, I want to give you a high level. Then just for fun, because we're kind of a small group, there is a video that I usually show. So I'm going to show it a little earlier. So we'll look at it next. And then we'll talk about in the video what they did in terms of these things sort of informally. And so, yeah. And that will get you kind of prepared. Then we'll do a deep dive on what these are. And then I have lots of stories to tell you, and we'll always think about this kind of framework. Okay, so information gathering is something you do where basically if you're going to do some sort of social engineering, the more you know about the person that you're attacking, the better it is in general, okay? And so you're going to have to try and gather that information. I'll give you lots of ideas of where you can get that information from, that kind of thing. People now, with social media and things like that. They say a lot. And a lot of the information that you need sometimes it's critical information. Some of it's just like kind of for small talk or that kind of thing. And so, anyways, it's useful to collect as much information. It's not necessarily about people. It might be about organizations. You're going to walk into a firm. You're going to impersonate being someone. You better know, who it is you have to talk to, who their boss is, who your supposed boss is at the supposed company you work for, all of that kind of information. Okay. The next is pretexting. Pretexting is a fancy way of saying impersonation, lying, pretending to be something you're not. Okay, so almost all of these attacks have some dimension where you're lying about who you are. You're pretending to be someone else. Okay, so it might be you're a different role. It might be you're a different person. Sometimes you're pretexting to be a very specific person. You're impersonating someone. In other cases, you're not impersonating someone in particular, but you're impersonating a certain class of person, like you're trying to look like an IT staff when you really aren't, or you're trying to look like a police officer when you really aren't, or whatever the case may be. Completely 100% illegal to impersonate the police, by the way. Okay, so pretexting is important. You have to think about, or an adversary would think about, what's the best pretext I can use? First off, what could I actually get away with? How can I sort of fine tune it so it's more believable? And a lot of human things is very subtle. It's sort of like you kind of get a gut feeling about oh, something's not right. This person doesn't seem like who they are. And so you have to really pay attention to very subtle things if you want to impersonate someone and have it come off very well. Okay, so pretexting is important. And then the final thing is I gather lots of information. I go in, I have a great pretext, completely tricked this person, then there's something I want at the end of the day. Okay, and if I walk in and they believe on an IT service, that's fine, but that's not the end goal. The end goal is to get access to that room. Okay, and so you have to ask for it, right? And when you ask for something, you have to persuade them that they should give you access to it. Okay, and so there's all sorts of manipulations that social engineers will play on when they want to persuade you to do something. Okay, and so influence, basically you want one of two things. So one is I'm trying to get you to do something for me, so I call that persuasion, and the other is I want some information from you. Okay, there's something I want to know from you, and so I call that elicitation. Okay, so they're both forms of influence, and it just depends on what you want to do. Not all social engineering attacks are 1, 2, 3, and sometimes they loop as well. You might do this, and then you might do elicitation, and the information you're getting is really for stage 1 of a broader attack. So you're doing sort of one social engineering attack to elicit some information. Once you've elicited that information, then you're going to do an even better or new social engineering attack to actually persuade the person to do what you want or something like that. Okay, so different attacks have a different kind of fingerprint in terms of how much emphasis they put on these, how exactly they walk through the sequence and all of that kind of thing. Okay, all right. So to think about this framework, instead of, I have a lot to say about each of these, so it will take a long time to get through all of these 4 things. So what we'll do is I'm going to show you a video, and then we'll talk about these kind of 4 things in the context of the video, and then next class after reading week, we'll go into the actual details on all the things that we might say about this. Okay. Okay, so first and foremost, I don't know how I'm going to put the video on the YouTube video of these lectures without infringing on copyright. But anyways, I'll try and figure that out. Okay, so the video's from a TV show. It's kind of cheesy, but it's good because it's actually pretty realistic. So it's a TV show. It's from the UK, and it's called The Real Hustle. It's basically about frauds and things like that. So it's like a reality TV show. They do some sort of scam on someone and they tape it all, and et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting about it is the person who wrote the textbook that I referred to was actually a consultant on this show. And I learned about this episode from his book because he used it as an example of one of the ones that he consulted on. And so not every like scam, I haven't watched the whole show. They're not all that great, but this one is actually like pretty good in terms of for its pedagogical value. It actually kind of touches on all of these different things. Okay, so it's so the author's name is Paul Hagney, if I remember correct. Okay, and before we kind of ruin the surprise, I want you to think about how you would do it. Okay, so this was the sort of the challenge that was proposed, and we'll spend a little time just thinking about how we might do it, and then you can see how they would do it. And with all these social engineering attacks, there's probably 100 different ways you could actually do it, and so you choose one way of actually doing it. But anyways, okay. Okay, so here's the challenge. Okay, so here's the challenge. You're going to steal someone's purse, wallet, whatever. You can probably do that without social engineering. That's fine. The tricky part is you have to get them to reveal to you what their PIN is for their debit card. Their debit card was in the purse or wallet that you just stole. Presumably, if you have this, then you can go and drain their bank account. Okay, it's harder to drain their bank account than it sounds because all ATMs have security cameras, et cetera, and they have limits and things like that. But anyways, this is the challenge. You can't use coercion. Okay, so you're not going to put a gun to their head and say, tell me your PIN. Okay, you're actually, even better yet, you're going to have them voluntarily tell it to you. So they actually want to tell it to you. Okay, does anyone have any ideas about how they might want to do this?
What's your relationship with the person? How do you know the person is like
Yeah, so certainly if you know them better, it would probably be easier, right? And so that would go to information gathering. So if you, first off, you could pick a victim that you know very well, then it might be easy. If you don't know them, then you could actually spend some time doing some information gathering in order to do it. So that's how information gathering could factor in. Any other ideas? You don't have to tell me a complete attack, but just sort of what are your impressions about how this might work?
I was going to say you can impersonate a bank teller telling them that you have a better offer. Of course, assuming that you know, for example, important dates in their lives like birthdays or important dates that mark them forever. This was part of information gathering. And then when you want to initiate the attack, you can just say that you're from a representative from the bank and that you offer something that is beneficial to them in a way that you persuade them that you are secure enough for them to hand you over a PIN or an account number. If you are in that stage where they trust you, when you establish trust, they'll be more susceptible to give you these kind of information since you are there to help them. And of course, you'll be backing yourself up by spoofing bank records or bank. So if they go and check it out, we'll check out that you're okay from the bank.
Okay, good. So in this case, we do some information gathering. The key element here is a pretext. So we're going to pretend to be someone else that we're not. And a bank employee is a great pretext. If you want some banking details, that's like probably the one person in the world that person would tell their PIN to and not have a problem with. It was if it was to someone who was banking. So in this case, we might call them up like a telemarketer kind of thing. And it's always a little hard to tell whether the person on the other end of the line is actually the bank or not. And so that's where you would fill the gap with information gathering. So you would know some details about them because you did your research. Then they might believe you. And then once they believe you, you would drop the persuasion on them, which is give me your PIN. Yeah. So that's very sensible. Other ideas?
I'm going to be a police and show them a bag.
Yeah.
And I'd say you have something bad in your bag and I want to seize your bag and seize it as well. And maybe then ask for the password.
Okay, good. So that would definitely work for the first one. So if you want to get possession, and maybe steal is the wrong part. I should say get possession because it's technically not theft if the police do it. Some might dispute that. But anyways, it's a seizure. And so in that case, yeah, you get the person the wallet. If you get their PIN or not, I don't know, like if you got arrested, if you would give the PIN or not. I guess you're maybe legally compelled to do it. But anyways, they could also just go directly to the bank.
Just give them a piece of paper that would say like you have some black money in your account and I want to verify that.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Okay. Anyways, definitely you watch lots of movies and TV shows. You see impersonating police all the time, right? And so that's a very common pretext. Yeah.
Means, obviously, we can impersonate as an enforcement official and get the bag or wallet or purse.
Yeah.
But we have to work in a group. Like I need to have one more person working with me in this camp, and I have to get a point of sale machine, and where this person is probably routinely visiting, and when like he or she types the PIN, I can put some kind of invisible ink or something and get the PIN.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So you could think of more of a technological attack where another thing that people tell their pins to is devices.
Yeah.
So they might not tell their pin to a person, but they'll definitely tell it. I tell my pin to lots of devices, ATMs, point of sale terminals. There is the whole card skimming attack where you basically have a fake point of sale terminal. And so that could be a very sensible way also to get someone's pin.
Can we say family? Impersonate family, a mother, or
Yeah, absolutely. So that's yeah. So that's another pretext that you could use. It's maybe a little harder to pull off, but
probably.
yeah.
People sometimes reuse their pins, so maybe if you know that they use another service, you can try to get that pin as at the other source and try to reuse it.
Okay, sure. So you could try and do something to try and guess what their pin is. So instead of getting them to tell it to you or stealing it, you could try and do a guessing attack. Things that would help you is knowing about past pins. You can also just know the distribution of pins that could help you. Maybe their pin is like their birthday or something like that. So it's something, if I know your birthday, I know a bit about you, so that's information gathering, and now I'm going to do a guessing attack. And so targeted guessing attacks are usually more powerful as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but nowadays, like banks are putting a limit. If you put 5 wrong PIN, the account gets like suspended or dormant.
Yeah.
You go and visit the branch, and so I think that may not work.
Yeah, so guessing, if you had a lot of guesses, it probably wouldn't work. If you had a pretty good sense of what it is, then it might actually work. Yeah, and there are sites, if you can do unthrottled guessing, you can actually buy tools, and what they'll do is a lot of people will choose like kind of work-related passwords or things like that. And so what you can do is you can point a web service or point your tool at a website of a company. It will go on the website, it will download every word on every web page of that site, and then it will build password dictionaries that are custom. So if there's like technical terms or something that just appear anywhere on one website somewhere in that company, then it will try those in password combinations, and it will kind of make you a custom password list as well. Yeah.
We can hypnotize people.
We can which? Hypnotize? Yeah, so hypnotism is actually kind of related. So when we talk about persuasion, we will talk about, there is a psychology behind persuading people to do things. And that's what hypnotists do, is they basically play some psychological tricks. Hypnotism, though, doesn't really, it's not as powerful as it looks. You need someone who's basically open to being hypnotized. And so, yeah, if someone's not open to it, you can't just hypnotize someone. They have to be highly suggestible or put themselves in a position to be suggestible, which you might do if you do hypnotists in like psychotherapy or something like that. But yeah.
For stealing the wallet, like we can use that security check. During the security check, you have to take out your wallet and everything. When they take out the wallet, you can take their debit card.
Yep.
They won't even notice after the check. Nobody notices.
Yeah.
Is that necessary to have to be debit card? If it's a credit card, you just have to just tap it for paying.
Sure, sure. Debit's the same way here too. Yeah. So if a transaction's under $100, you can tap it. Yeah. But anyways, just for the fun of it, I made it a PIN. Okay. I'll take 2 more ideas, these 2, and then that's it.
We could say that you won a certain prize or the lottery or something, and we could say that we can just credit the amount to your credit card, and then we can have a compromised POS terminal, and that could have a keylogger on it. So you just put the debit card, and you can get that card number. Everything will be stored in it. Also the PIN. So you can just then use online transaction to.
Okay, so in this case, the pretext is a compromised POS, so that's fine. So you don't have to pretext a person, you can pretext machines. And in this case, what you're doing is, persuasion works really well if you make a gratuitous promise. So if you're like, you just have to do this thing and then you'll get this thing that you really want, like all the money that you won in the lottery, or I know you really like a sports team and I have these tickets and like, here's a PDF, like just pick your seat, like where you want to sit off of this PDF. Meanwhile, the PDF is malicious. But if you can trick people like by enticing them, that absolutely works. So that's one of the psychologies of persuasion. Yeah. There was another idea?
Yes, I might find someone sometimes who are not that much smart in giving card information online for registering something like that. So you may want to get assistance from you.
Mm-hmm.
When it happened to me last day, wanted to get registered and asking me how to put this information. So he was asking me like what is the expired date of debit card and what is the CVV. So I could even just say that give me the picture of the card and I will give them information. I will do it for you, do the payment for you. So this is how I can get his ID, the number of his card, and at the same time his name, his expiry date, and the 3-pin security code. And
right.
By this information, I can even buy anything online.
Sure.
So it's easily possible.
Yeah, right. So here I was thinking a PIN like that you actually type in, but if you want to buy things online, if it's a credit card, not a debit card, then absolutely you don't even need, there's no secret memorization to it, right? All you need is information that's actually visible on the card itself. And so even just stealing the card is enough. Then you can go and buy things online. Yeah. And so credit card theft is a lot harder than debit theft. Or sorry, it's a lot easier than debit theft because of that, because you don't actually, there's no authentication in terms of how something you know. Yeah.
Something called card not present scenario.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's in the Visa actual standard. Okay, let me show you this video before we run out of time, and then we'll talk a bit about the video.
Security guards and steal £5,000. We ruin a woman's life by taking her hand.
We'll make it like a movie in here.
And losing the lot. Through your letterbox, we expose a popular crime happening on housing estates today. We're going to uncover the secrets behind the most popular scams being carried out by con artists in Britain today. Our real hustlers are Alex, a confidence trickster; Jess, a sexy swindler; Paul, a scam artist. They've been travelling the UK to demonstrate to our hidden cameras exactly how the cons work. All the people in this show have been hustled for real, and after being given their money back, they agreed that the footage could be shown, so you can avoid being ripped off by the same scams.
We all know that feeling of shock and panic when something of value is stolen. In this con, the hustler uses that feeling to manipulate the mark into doing something they wouldn't ordinarily do.
Alex, Jess and Paul arrive at the service entrance of a large London shopping arcade. They make their way to the cafe area on the second floor, a suitable hunting ground for our team. They split up to take up their positions for today's scam, the bag and pin snatch. Alex and Jess are pretending to be tourists whilst keeping an eye out for a suitable victim. They have chosen this woman, and it's her handbag that's the target. The bag is going to be snatched, but that's only half the plan. The stakes are much higher, as you will soon see. Alex and Jess wait for an opportunity to make their move, while Paul watches proceedings from the back of the cafe. This is their chance. The woman's friend leaves the table, and the mark is now alone and vulnerable.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I come too. But when will I see you? No? When I come back? Yeah, no. Hang on, we take one photo. Okay, one second. Excuse me, can you take a photo? 1 second.
Alex and Jess distract the mark and maneuver her into turning her back on her handbag.
Like this.
There's Paul. He's going in for the steal.
I have to put it on here. 1 second. I think it's like this.
Thank you.
Instead of doing a runner, Paul takes a seat near the mark's table. Alex and Jess have their photo, but the mark turns back to realise her bag is gone. Out of sight of the mark, Alex has to get somewhere fast. The mark is distressed.
Okay.
Paul talks to her, but she doesn't suspect that her handbag is less than 2 meters away in Paul's briefcase. This is the big hit. The team are going to try and fool the mark into giving them her card pin, as well as her personal details.
Excuse me, do you have anything valuable in it? Do you have like bank cards or anything? What bank are you with? I work for Barclays. Yeah, let's cancel your bank cards. Have a seat. Don't worry. Have a seat.
Did you not see anyone come here?
No. There was somebody walking through, but hold on. Hold on.
Alex wants to sound like he's in a call centre and not in the cab of a van, so he plays in a sound effects CD of office numbers.
Alright, look, that's the bank call centre there. Speak to them. Cancel your cards, okay?
Hello? I'm very sorry to hear about that, but I can certainly assist you with this call. Do you know your account number and sort code?
With the help of the sound effects, Alex has convinced the mark that he is a bank call centre operator, and she dutifully gives him her bank details.
Okay. Now I need your full name and your postcode, please.
She still has no idea it was Paul who took her handbag, and is hiding it in his case on the next table.
Okay. Now, I've got the card details here. It doesn't look like anyone's tried to use it, so it's a good job you called us straight away. Now, the last thing I need from you in order to cancel your card is your 4-digit PIN number. Now, I can't take this off you myself because we're not allowed to take PIN numbers, so I'm going to have to put you through to the automated service. Okay?
Alex now plays back a message from Jess recorded earlier.
After the tone, please enter your 4-digit PIN number, followed by the hash key.
Alex records the tones, which could easily be decoded later to reveal the PIN.
Your card has now been cancelled. Thank you for calling. Goodbye.
The mark is grateful to the Good Samaritan.
Alright. Yeah. Alright.
But Paul's walking away with her handbag. Worse still, she thinks her account is now safe, whereas in reality, the real hustlers have done enough to completely empty her finances. It started as a distraction robbery. It developed into a card pin and identity theft. A potentially devastating combination for the victim. It's time to put her out of her misery and let her know how bad it could have been.
I pretty much carry my whole life in my handbag anyway. My cards and
man, everything. So a person on the phone, that's just a whole scam. Everything's a scam. Then they're just gonna get all my details, then aren't they? And just then they can do whatever they want. Well, it's only you this time. Oh no. So I'm so shaky.
There's two very important elements that make this con work so well. First, when we get the mark to take a photo of myself and Jess, she's concentrating on us. She's not looking at her bag, and that gives Paul a perfect opportunity for a clean steal. Second, when she makes the phone call, everything is as it should be. There's office noises in the background, there's phones ringing, there is nothing to arouse suspicion. And without thinking, in panic, she gives all her information straight to us.
Always try and keep your wits about you. And if something doesn't seem right, then ask questions. But what you must always remember is that the only person that knows your PIN number is you. The bank don't know it, and it shouldn't ask for it. So if they do, then you should be immediately suspicious.
We meet people who have lost their handbags every day, and the effect on them is devastating. They lose their phones, they lose their address books, house keys, car keys, cash, cards. All these things got to be replaced, and they have to basically reorganise their life.
Anyways, you can watch more of the show if you're interested. How many would fall for that? You don't have to raise your hand. Okay, so I like this attack because it actually kind of follows this framework a little bit. So let's dissect it quickly. Okay, this attack actually has very minimal information gathering. They just pick someone randomly at the mall. So there's basically little to none. Other attacks we'll look at later are more reliant on information gathering. Okay, the second component is a pretext. So a pretext, remember, is impersonating someone or lying about who you are, that kind of thing. What was the pretext in this attack? Sorry?
Bank worker.
Okay, bank worker. And someone said something else. Okay, so there's actually more than one pretext here. This attack actually consisted of 4 pretexts, 3 or 4, depending on how you want it to count. So the first one was sort of minor, but there were the kind of tourists who were like, "Can you take my picture?" That was just a distraction. But anyways, they looked like tourists. They were a couple. They, were sort of people that you might expect want to have a picture taken of them. There was nothing that was sort of strange or off in that particular scenario. Okay, the second is the guy who is pretending to be the bank employee. Do you look like a bank employee?
Yeah. With the suitcase.
Yeah? Why? Okay, so he had a briefcase.
He was like full suit.
He had a suit. Do you seem too old to be a banker? Too young? If he was a teenager in a suit with a briefcase, would he look like a banker? Right? So maybe like kind of the right age. Yeah. Kind of old. Kind of looks like someone who sat at a desk maybe for all of his life. Yeah. Yes.
He was confident as well when he said.
Okay. So very, very confident. Sort of took control of the situation. He knew right away the phone number of the bank, even though it wasn't the real one, but that's something you would expect. So it's consistent. Another thing that he didn't do, but he could have done that would have been really good too, is a lot of people think of business cards as like kind of authenticating information, but anyone can get a business card that says anything, right? And so he could have been like, "What bank are you with?" Have about 5 business cards for like the 5 major banks, and when they're like, "Oh, we're with CIBC" or whatever, then he pulls out a bank card. "Oh, I'm with CIBC," and hands it to them. Okay, and for a lot of people, that's actually if someone gives you a business card and it says CIBC, you're sold, right? They work at CIBC. So he didn't do that in this case, but that could have been a finesse. So an add-on could be reveal a business card. Okay, then when she called, there was the pretext of the call center employee. And so there were little details. Once again, like a lot of things, if you're being tricked, it's kind of like a gut feeling, like something just doesn't feel right. So here they try to make sure that everything just sort of seemed right. So you have like kind of the office noise that's being played in the background. The way he talked kind of sounded like a call center employee, like sort of, kind of scripted, kind of bored, like kind of, I don't know. And then the third component was the quote-unquote automated system that would take the actual pin.
And the girl voice also.
Yeah, so that's part of that too. So it sounded kind of real, like it was sort of like a robotic kind of voice, or at least a scripted voice, which is what you would kind of expect. Yeah, okay. Then the final thing is you want to exert some influence. So now you have them sold. She believes you're a bank employee. She believes she's talking to a bank. Now you have to do the ask. You have to get the PIN from her. So it's elicitation in this case. But you're going to do the actual influence. And so at this point, if the person just said, give me your PIN, she might have done it. Who knows? Okay. But they did do a few things to try and set it up, to try and smooth over that persuasion, or sorry, that influence, to try and make it more likely that the person would comply. So the first thing is they created a stressful environment. When people are under stress, they want to solve their question. Like they're not thinking critically, and whatever the easiest path is to like kind of undo whatever's causing their stress, they'll jump at it even if it's not sensible. Okay, so people under stress do abandon rational critical thought a lot of times. Another thing that probably made it easier is because the person didn't ask for it, it was this automated system. She sort of typed it in on the phone. It sort of seems kind of safer. Like maybe this whole thing's a fraud, but at the end of the day, I just sort of told my PIN to a computer. Like nobody's ever going to know what it is, okay? And so there's something to me anyway that's kind of subtle about the fact that it's nicer to like kind of type it in. It feels more secure. It doesn't feel as sketchy as like somebody asking you for what your PIN is. Another piece of the influence that was sort of critical, this is more persuasion than elicitation, is this whole thing wouldn't have worked if she whipped out her own cell phone and said, okay, I'm going to call the bank, right? And so it was absolutely critical that she took the bank employee's phone, Okay, so victim used bank employee's phone.
Could be in her bag or her phone was in the bag.
Perfect, perfect.
It was like really old, so not many people like carries phone.
Yeah. Okay, so if you want to lock this down, and a lot of social engineering is paying attention to those details. So you know there's all these scenarios that could happen. You can't just assume that someone's going to react in a certain way. And so you have to have a contingency plan for all of them. And you also have to try and take people's options away so that they kind of walk down the path that you want. So if the phone's in the bag, then you don't really have that option, right? So you remove that option. Let's say you do have the phone. What's CIBC's phone number? Anyone bank with CIBC? What bank do you bank with? What's the phone number of your bank? Quickly. You don't know. Where? Well, how do you find it? Okay, you could Google it, or you look on the back of the card. That's usually, like, if I'm going to cancel my Visa, but where's your card? Your card's gone, right?
But at the same time, if a bank employee tells you this is a direct number, then you have an option that,
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. Yeah, so they're like, we know the number, like, and they're on the line right now, right? So it just smooths that whole process. So you don't have to be like, oh, what's the number? But I don't have my phone, and I don't even have my card, and that kind of thing. Oh yeah, that too. Yeah, so that's nice. So it removes the friction of the whole like automated. Yeah, customer service. Sorry, someone was saying something. Yeah.
A person starts trusting everyone when he's in like stressful condition.
Yeah.
Whoever will give advice, he will.
Yeah, exactly. So creating this stressful situation also makes it really, really important. And the final thing too that's also related to that is, let's say that you were skeptical, right? What's being like somebody's in sort of in your face and they're helping you, like they're holding out a phone, right? So go through the process of rejecting that. What would you say to this person? You'd be like, oh, well, like, you know, thanks for your help, but like, I don't really believe that you're a bank employee and you're, you know, and so you're kind of raising the stakes so that if somebody wants to be kind of skeptical, they kind of almost have to insult you, right? So if you can get in a situation where then they're adverse, right? They have this adversity to trying to like say that you are lying to them essentially, right? And so you can sort of raise the stakes in that sense way. And then it's easier to just give in because you don't risk offending someone else at the same time, right? So, yeah, so you... Right? So if their only path to doing the right thing is to offend you, then that's good, right? Then they're less likely to do that. Yeah.
Like nowadays, like you can use your mobile app to block your card. What if the victim uses that one? Or what happens if there is a service center happens to be there in the mall itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So this might not work today with all the modern banking technology and phone apps and things like that. Yeah. So there's a lot of what ifs kind of thing. If yeah, true. Yeah. All valid points. Yeah. Other comments, questions?
Comments.
Yeah, comments. Comments are good.
The scenario was good, but there was a few things that were off, like asking the victim right away, which bank do you deal with there? Like he was straight up like, okay, which bank? Okay, let's do this. Let's fix this.
Yep.
And then the thing on the phone, the guy on the phone, he didn't authenticate. Like he didn't ask, okay, who are you? Like kind of like asked at the end of the call, like, okay, by the way, what's your name? What's your last name?
Right. Yeah. So that's true. So the phone call might not have followed a typical script, what you would expect. Like, I'm going to authenticate you, so can you tell me a bit about your last transactions or that type of thing? Yeah. So some of this might be just, this is like 10 years old, this clip and things like that. But yeah. Is there anything else that people felt were kind of off or could be improved? Or any comments in general? Yeah.
You could go to the manager to see the cameras instead.
Sure. There's lots of options. She's in a mall, so maybe this isn't actually the best place because there's probably a branch of the bank in the mall. And so there actually would be a very easy option. Probably be a better attack somewhere that's like removed from a bank. But yeah.
It's true that she don't have her own phone and she have to believe on the person who offered her phone. But if she check the number, it's not. If it is of service center number, it starts with the different number. Like we have ordinary people have 514348.
Right.
But the service center definitely have the other number.
Right.
Probably is the number.
Yeah, sure. So she could try and get some information about the number before jumping in. Even better yet, she could be like, well, she could dial them. So there's a difference between someone dialing you and you dialing back as well. So that's another trick. If telemarketers call and you're like, I don't know if you're actually CIBC, you can be like, well, I'm going to call you back, right? And then you can check the number. But yeah, certainly if it was some sketchy like 1-900 number or something like that, then that could be a red flag. Yeah.
My one is, should he even try to call our phone number? Since the guy sitting beside her, she could just ask, let me call my number from your number.
Yeah, okay, sure. And then the phone would start ringing in his briefcase. Yeah. So that would be a problem. So you probably wouldn't want to do that. Usually you probably want to get the purse out of the vicinity. But I guess he sat with it just because it was less suspicious than kind of walking through in case someone saw it. But the whole thing was kind of risky anyways, like just grabbing the purse. But a lot of people aren't really paying attention. But yeah. If the phone went off, that definitely would be a big problem. Other ideas, comments? Okay, so what we'll do next class is I'll give you a lot more detail in general about how to do these main components of the attack. And then I'll tell you lots of more stories that are like this of these attacks being used in the real world. So thank you. Next week's reading week. No office hours tomorrow. So I'll see you in a little bit of time.
No class next week.
No class which?
No class next week.